Just waiting for the recording to start. I hope recording is okay for everyone, so we can upload this to our YouTube channels for those who can't join us today. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar today, launching our report, Development at What Cost? So for today's agenda, I will provide a short introduction of the report of the Fair Finance Coalition and our webinar speakers and participants today. We will be uploading this recording after the webinar, and you will be able to find our report as well on different websites. So thank you for joining. The Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa is a regional civil society coalition made up of organizations across South Africa and Mozambique. That is 350africa.org, the Center for Environmental Rights, the African Climate Reality Project, the Institute for Economic Justice, Fossil Free South Africa, the Center for Applied Legal Studies, Oxfam South Africa, and Justice Ambiental from Mozambique. Our mission at the coalition is to ensure that public finance institutions, the very bodies accountable to public interest, invest in a manner that is sustainable, transparent, and aligned with environmental and human rights standards. We track investment policies and practices of these public finance institutions and measure them against international standards. Our goal is simple: ensure that public funds serve the long-term well-being of people rather than international profits, environmental degradation, or exacerbating the climate crisis. Coming to our report, in 2024, the coalition published its third Financing Fairly policy assessment. These policy assessments evaluate how well the policies of South Africa's public finance institutions align with internationally recognized sustainability standards and a just energy transition, as well as human rights. Our findings unfortunately revealed that none of the institutions had policies that exclude new gas exploration or pipelines, and all institutions we assessed backed fossil gas in the region. Today, we are launching our latest case study, authored by Zara Omar, which moves from high-level policy evaluation to a real-world case study. Through these assessments, we identified this project in particular. The report is titled Development at What Cost? The IDC and the Kinetiko gas project zooms in on the financial partnership between the DFI, or Development Finance Institution, and Kinetiko's energy subsidiary, Afro Energy. The Kinetiko gas project aims to be South Africa's largest onshore liquefied natural gas venture in Mpumalanga, a region already suffering as a mining and pollution hotbed. As a state-owned institution, the IDC operates under a clear mandate to promote sustainable industrial development, adhere to our constitutional right to a clean environment under Section 24, and fulfill international obligations like the Paris Agreement. Across Southern Africa and beyond, we are seeing a dangerous narrative take hold, one that frames fossil gas as a harmless or cleaner alternative or a necessary bridge fuel towards a low-carbon economy. But as the International Energy Agency has made clear, there can be no new fossil fuel projects, including coal, oil, or gas, if we are to meet net zero targets and limit global warming. By financing and endorsing new upstream gas projects, institutions like the IDC risk locking South Africa into high carbon dependence, creating stranded assets and threatening local water and air quality, as well as community livelihoods. Over the next 90 minutes, we will connect the dots between public finance policy and lived realities on the ground and in the region. We will break down the report's key findings, hear from community leadership in Mpumalanga about the realities of public consultations and local environmental concerns. Hopefully, we may have a change in the agenda. We will also look at the legal avenues and appeals being used in these licenses and draw vital regional lessons from Mozambique, where large-scale gas developments have led to severe human rights violations. We'd also love to hear from you. We have our co-hosts watching the chat box, so please also feel free to put your name, your organization into the chat box, and we will have a Q&A later on in the agenda. So first off, I would like to introduce our first speaker, which is the lead author of the report, Zara, to present the core findings of the study. So Zara Omar is a South African lawyer with a focus on environmental and human rights law. She currently practices as an advocate of the High Court and is a member of the Cape Bar. Prior to joining the bar, Zara practiced as an attorney in the Center for Environmental Rights Corporate Accountability and Transparency Program, challenging corporates and financial institutions for environmental harms. Zara has played a key role in the Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa, including leading the coalition's policy assessments over the last few years. So I will now hand over to Zara. You are now a co-host, so if you'd like to present your screen, that should be available now. Thank you.
Thanks, Alia. I'll just share my PowerPoint. Is that visible?
Yes, I can see. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Today, we're talking about the IDC's financial involvement in the Kinetiko gas study. I'll be taking you through the main findings of the report and under 5 main headings, and that will be looking at why we chose this case study in particular. What is the Kinetiko gas project? What is the IDC's involvement in the project? What is the IDC's policy position on gas? And what are the IDC's legal obligations with respect to financing gas? So why this case study? So globally, as you've seen, natural gas, as it's called, or fossil gas, is being positioned as a cleaner solution to the energy and the climate crisis. And the production of LNG, liquefied natural gas, is just one type of fossil gas that's been rapidly increasing over the last few decades. This push for fossil gas is also evident from South Africa's own policy and legislative developments over the last while. For example, our latest electricity plan proposes 6,000 megawatts of new gas power generation by 2030. And this can also be seen from South Africa's enactment of the UPRDA, the Upstream Petroleum Resources Development Act. This was also reflected in the coalition's last policy assessment report, Financing Fairly 2024, which revealed that all of South Africa's public finance institutions have policies that support gas and the expansion of gas projects in the Southern African region. In particular, South Africa's 2 key development finance institutions, the Development Bank of Southern Africa and the Industrial Development Corporation, have both endorsed the use of gas as a transition fuel. In 2021 already, the International Energy Agency warned us that there should be no new development of gas and oil fields beyond 2021 if we are to reach net zero by 2050. So it's in this context that we must interrogate the role of financial institutions, because these high emitting industries don't happen without finance. And so financial flows ultimately have a hand in whether we are going to escape or reinforce fossil fuel lock-in in our region. And the emphasis is on new developments, because what we see is that public finance institutions are not just continuing to finance the existing fossil fuel projects, but are actively financing new corporations that are actively developing new fossil fuel projects like the Kinetiko gas project. And as I mentioned, this could lead into lock-in over decades within this high-emitting sector. And this is ultimately at odds with our just transition and climate-related commitments made by South Africa and these very same financial institutions. So what is the Kinetiko gas project? Um, it's known as South Africa's largest onshore liquid natural gas project, liquefied natural gas project, or it aims to be the largest. And it will unlock sorry, just getting the figure, 6 trillion cubic meters of gas in the initial phase and even more later on. And so we've zoomed into one of the financial institutions that we assessed in the 2024 policy assessment, the Industrial Development Corporation, that has supported this project financially. Um, and looking more into the project, um, it's operated by Afrogas, which is a subsidiary of Kinetiko Energy, an Australian-based company. The aim of the project is to commercialize an energy solution for South Africa for use by major industrial users such as Sasol and Eskom. Afro Energy currently holds 4 exploration rights for this gas production, or exploration rather, in Mpumalanga, which is our mining and pollution hotbed. Afrogas commenced these activities in 2020 already, and is currently in its second renewal period for 3 of its exploration rights, which will continue operations until about August next year. Afro Energy has indicated that it intends to apply for production rights over these same areas, and this will allow it to conduct full-scale development for production of gas over 30 years, renewable for another 30 years. Kinetiko has indicated that it has already applied for a production right over one of its sites in 2023, but the status of this production right remains unclear. And one of the concerns raised by civil society organizations is that while Kinetiko had exploration rights, which gave it the signal to conduct pilot production activities only relating to exploration, its activities went beyond this and into the realm of what a production right would entail. And so the question is, who authorized Kinetiko to undertake these production activities under their current exploration rights? Civil society did ask for clarification on this from PASA, the regulator that authorized these licenses, but those requests have gone unanswered. So while Kinetiko has framed this as an energy and climate solution for South Africa, civil society has challenged this project, which Tarisai will speak about more, and regards this project as a decarbonization U-turn. So what is the IDC's involvement in the project? The pilot phase of the project was initially budgeted at approximately 155 million, of which the IDC committed 70 million and Afro Energy 85 million. And for this purpose, a joint venture between Afro Energy and the IDC was entered into, and a special purpose vehicle was developed called Afro Gas, which was the implementing vehicle for this project. From the information we found, the IDC advanced an initial amount of 16.3 million, and this amount was repaid in early last year. At the time, Kinetiko had also indicated that should the pilot project program prove successful, which it did, it would consider a larger IDC joint venture to further develop the project into South Africa's largest onshore LNG project. So we do note here that Fair Finance did engage with the IDC from the get-go of the research process in September last year and throughout the process of developing this case study. In September last year, we notified the IDC of the research process. We asked specifically for any information and documents relating to the project. We didn't receive any information. Then in December, we sent the IDC a draft of the case study for comment. We did receive a response from the IDC in January 2026, which was quite a vague and peculiar response, saying that it wished to clarify its position on the Kinetiko project, and asking for the case study to be revised. So essentially, it said that it had no outstanding financial exposure to the project, that although it did approve and disperse funds for the initial phase of the project, those funds were not used by Kinetico and they were returned in full. It also said that the IDC is not involved in the ongoing development or production activities and does not hold any equity or co-investment in the current production fields. So following this response, the coalition sought clarity on what the IDC was saying. We sent a letter to the IDC in February this year asking specific questions. As you can see, we asked whether the reasons for the non-use of the funds, what that reason was. We asked whether the IDC's initial approval and disbursement of the funds meant that the project had passed the IDC's due diligence processes, which we assume it did. We asked about the status of the joint venture between the IDC and Kinetico subsidiary Afrogas, and whether the IDC or the joint venture had funded any of the pilot production projects in the initial phases. We also raised broader concerns about the IDC's position on natural gas, and asking whether it would support a phase out for gas projects in light of climate commitments and the urgent need to phase out fossil fuels. An initial meeting was arranged with the IDC, which was then postponed at short notice, and they asked us to follow up with written questions, which we did. And after that, no response was received despite various follow-ups. So as the coalition, we maintain that since the IDC did approve and disperse the funding, even though it was initial funding and it was repaid, it demonstrates that the IDC was still willing to finance this carbon-intensive project, that it passed its due diligence processes, and demonstrates a potential evidence of foreseeability on the IDC's behalf and the scale of climate risk within the bank's portfolio, which is what our concern is. So what is the IDC's policy position on gas? The IDC positions itself as a driver of inclusive and sustainable industrialization in South Africa. Its legislative mandate is to promote sustainable industrial development. Its sustainability is framed as central to the IDC's strategy, with a focus on advancing sustainable development through green investments in new energy vehicles, critical minerals, battery value chains, and renewable energy to support the just transition. Notwithstanding these commitments, a tension does emerge between the IDC's stated policy objectives and the just energy transition, and its financing practices. While emphasizing its support for the just energy transition, the IDC continues to actively finance fossil fuel exploration and development projects, like the Kinetiko gas project. This does raise a concern about the IDC's policy alignment with its own legislative mandate, but also with international sustainability standards, with South Africa's climate commitments, and with domestic and international legal obligations relating to climate change, human rights, and sustainable development. The IDC's policies and priorities are aligned with South Africa's own national development policy frameworks, so the National Development Plan, and the Economic and Reconstruction and Recovery Plan. And among these development outcomes of the IDC is the facilitation of a greener economy, and it positions its financing of gas as a transition fuel within this facilitation of a greener economy. Um, Looking ahead, the IDC has indicated that its emphasis for 2026 will be on developing its regional gas value chain and further into the future, in the context of anticipated shortages in natural gas supply to South Africa. Um, and so we can argue that because the IDC has explicitly acknowledged its support for the just energy transition and for a low carbon economy, its financing of a new gas project like the Kinetiko was done knowingly and can actively freeze our future transition efforts. Sorry, just to touch on the IDC sustainability policies, we did analyze these policies in detail in Financing Fairly 2024, and we found the IDC's policies to be wholly inadequate with international sustainability standards, particularly its environmental and social and due diligence framework and its responsible investment policy, which does not include any exclusions for fossil fuels or high carbon intensive projects. Um, if I can just check, yeah. So the IDC ranked seventh out of the 8 public finance institutions that we assessed in terms of their policies. And we do hope that in this year's policy assessment, the IDC will do better. Um, So, like I said, those policies were shown to be inadequate. But what we also found was that the IDC does not have any policies that exclude any companies engaged in new gas exploration and development from its investment and financing. Um, it does not establish a measurable target to reduce its finance for fossil fuel power generation. Um, Either in itself or relative to its finance for renewable energy generation. And it also does not provide a complaint mechanism for communities that may be adversely affected by its financed activities. The IDC also mentioned its sustainability report in a couple of their policies, but does not make this publicly available despite referencing it. So against this context, the IDC support for the Kinetiko gas project is not really a surprise or not misaligned with the IDC's own policies, especially in terms of its support for gas as a transition fuel. Um, and that could be the reason why the funding was approved and dispersed and passed the IDC's own due diligence processes. But this does highlight a fundamental issue in that the IDC's policies in its current form are inadequate in terms of sustainability standards. Um, and what this means is that projects like the Kinetiko gas project can proceed in the future with the IDC's support, um, despite significant concerns regarding environmental and climate and social impacts. So what are the IDC's legal obligations when it comes to the financing of gas? So because the IDC is a state-owned institution, as a state, South Africa has particular domestic and international obligations when it comes to sustainable development and in particular climate change, human rights, and protecting the environment. Um, and these obligations do apply equally to public or state-owned entities on behalf of the state, including public finance institutions. Um, so under South Africa's international legal obligations, the IDC would have specific obligations related to climate change. So for example, South Africa is a party to the Paris Agreement, and apart from the 1.5 target, there's also further obligations to make finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And then under the landmark ICJ advisory opinion on climate change and state obligations, which was adopted as a UN General Assembly resolution last year. The court ruled that states have a duty to prevent significant harm to the environment by acting with due diligence and to use all means at their disposal to prevent activities carried out within their jurisdiction or control from causing significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment. And what's important is that the court also confirmed that these duties extend to the governance of public entities acting on behalf of the state. And this includes multilateral development banks and public finance institutions. In terms of South Africa's human rights obligations, sustainable development, as you know, is inseparable from the protection of human rights, particularly in relation to local and marginalized communities. And so human rights infringements in the development context may arise both through adverse environmental and social impacts of bank finance projects, but also indirectly through the financing of projects with high greenhouse gas emissions, such as gas projects, that contribute to climate change and the associated harms. So South Africa is bound by the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and also the broader International Bill of Rights. A joint statement on human rights and climate change that was released a few years ago said that states should also discontinue financial incentives or investments in activities and infrastructure that are not consistent with low greenhouse gas emissions pathways, whether undertaken by public or private actors as a mitigation measure to prevent further damage and risk. So against this backdrop, continued public financing of fossil fuels may not only undermine South Africa's climate commitments, but also is quite difficult to reconcile with South Africa's international human rights obligations. When it comes to domestic legal obligations, Section 24, which is our environmental right in the Constitution, also provides a right to sustainable development. And so the IDC's obligations to finance development projects that are sustainable is also grounded in our constitutional framework. And this is binding on all organs of state, including development finance institutions such as the IDC. And so it does impose a clear obligation on the IDC to support development and the use of our natural resources, in the words of Section 24B3, that is ecologically sustainable, while simultaneously promoting justifiable economic and social development. And so this obligation arises both both by virtue of the IDC's status as an organ of state, but also through its statutory mandate to promote sustainable industrial development in South Africa. So lastly, our report provides some recommendations for the IDC with regards to its finance and investment practices, its policies and plans, but then also with regard to climate risk and avoiding that risk. The report is available on the Fair Finance website. And just to say also that before this research process, the Center for Environmental Rights did also submit a access to information request to the IDC regarding the Kinetiko project as far back as 2023 or 2024. That access to information request was refused. The refusal was taken up with the information regulator, which is still under investigation. But it just shows that the Kinetiko project is not just about financing a carbon-intensive project, but it's also about lack of transparency, and it's also about a failure to center communities in the IDC's decision-making processes. As we'll hear later, that consultation in the community surrounding the project was inadequate. And also a failure from the IDC to properly engage with the coalition regarding their financing processes and approvals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zara. The evidence has been clear for me to understand the policies and what implications they may have depending on how they are implemented. Unfortunately, we don't have one of our speakers here today, but I would like to read out his bio as they did play a big role in the area, challenging some of these projects. So just to read out the information, Veli Aluta Nsuku is a human rights activist based in the mining town of Welkom in the Free State. He is an executive member of the Free State Environmental Justice Network, and he is also the national chairperson of the Mining and Environmental Justice Network of South Africa, or MEJCON SA. So our engagements with different organizations and community groups have been essential in joining the dots between what the policies say, what development is needed, and what happens on the ground. I would like to present our next speaker, Tarisai. Tarisai is the head of the mining program at the Center for Environmental Rights, is passionate about human rights causes. Before joining CER, she interned at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, where she was part of a trial team litigating against genocide in Rwanda. She later articled and practiced as an attorney at Lawyers for Human Rights. Tarisai will draw lessons from the coalition's previous Mozambique gas case study and also reflect on the broader regional consequences of large-scale gas development projects and touch on a little bit about the case that has happened in the Free State. So Tarisai, over to you. You are a co-host as well, so you should be able to present any screen. Thank you. You're
Sorry,
muted. Yeah, thanks.
am I muted?
Now you're back on. Thank you.
I'm back on. Okay. I'm just going to share my screen. I was just saying thank you for introducing me and a good morning to everyone. I'll share my screen now. Don't know if it is visible.
Yes, visible now. Thank you.
Okay. There we go. So the Center for Environmental Rights, and working together with the Fair Finance Coalition, has been looking at the challenge that is posed by development finance institutions when they fund fossil fuel projects, what it means for the broader context of the just transition, what it means for us for meeting our net zero targets for 2050. But then the conversation then stems into what does then this mean for communities who have been largely impacted by fossil fuel production, such as coal, the climate impacts, the health impacts, and the socioeconomic impacts for those communities. In looking at what we call the Afro Energy ER 383 appeal, and in considering opposing this and assisting the coalition of communities in opposing the appeal, we had to consider, firstly, of a concern for us is, as you'll see, that this project spans over 240,000 hectares. That means it spans across 3 districts, 2 provinces, Mpumalanga and the Free State. We brought a Section 43 appeal in terms of the National Environmental Management Act. This was done in June of 2025, and it was on behalf of the Free State Environmental Justice Network. This is a coalition of a number of community-based organizations that look at challenging fossil fuel applications within their communities. As I stated, this spans across 2 provinces, which is of a concern. 3 municipalities, Fezile Dabi, Thabo Mofutsanyane, and the Sibande district. So that means it touches Free State, Virginia, it touches Amersfoort in Mpumalanga, and it is a broad expansion of a project that is being proposed. What we found concerning in looking at this particular project is one, that the DMRE had granted environmental authorization for this project in June of 2025. We then brought an appeal in terms of Section 23 of NEMA, but the lack of concern around the issues raised by communities around public participation, around the climate impacts, also about the fact that for most of these provinces where this project is to ensue is that it is already considered, for example, for Mpumalanga, it is already considered a high priority area in terms of air pollution. It is heavily marked by existing coal mining that is happening. So to introduce gas production in such an area, there's a lack of consideration for environmental impacts for communities there. This is also inclusive of the Free State, Virginia, that there is some coal mining, but there is already an existing production right that has been given to another company called Renergen, and the lack of consideration for community interests and climate interests for communities was of a concern for us. At the center of that is the fact that in the application for the environmental authorization, and the potential funding or the putting of equity by the IDC in this project, that there is no mechanism for the IDC as a finance institution that is looking at investment to consider whether this would be a viable investment and what will be the consideration for communities in the instance where such financing has not considered what the community interests would be. So this appeal was brought by the Center for Environmental Rights on behalf of the Free State Environmental Justice Network. This is a group, like I said, of civil society structures, community-based organizations that are concerned for and work around environmental justice, land use, and look at the public participation of affected communities in applications for mining or for fossil fuel production in the area. The appeal stated 7 grounds of appeal, the first being climate change, in that the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy failed to consider climate impacts of the project on the communities. The second being air quality, to assess the impacts of ambient air quality for the residents, already considering that it is an area that is highly polluted by coal mining. The impact of groundwater, considering that South Africa is a water scarce country, the fact that there's already a lot of other types of mining happening in the area, what would be the consideration for groundwater impacts if we are to have gas production within the area? The fourth being socioeconomic impacts. If you are to look at the provinces where this mining is to happen, is that there is, my apologies, there is an issue around agriculture, that there is a lot of farming, formal mining and informal mining that happens. There is some consideration to tourism within the area. And further to that, then there is the issue around potential and viable job options for the communities. What does it mean when production is to happen in a community and that production is funded as having to provide jobs within an area? What type of jobs will be offered? What will be the skill set for that will be required for that job within the community? and need and desirability, in the fact that, like I've indicated, that this is an area that is heavily marred by mining, and coal mining in particular. Is there need and desirability of this particular project to go on? And the biggest consideration of all, the public participation, the fact that there was inadequate public participation in regards to the project, that there were no adequate notices put up, that the community was given documents that voluminous in nature, but not translated to any local language for them to be able to adequately engage on what is being proposed, and make submissions with regards to their thoughts on what is being proposed. Of the biggest consideration is the element around procedural justice and the right to be heard. One, from the fact that from an IDC perspective, there isn't anything in law or in their policies that even looks at procedural justice and the need for communities to be adequately engaged. As we represented and as we consulted with the Free State Environmental Justice Network, what became apparent was the fact that there were no adequate notices that had been put up. A number of communities within the areas, the two provinces, had not been adequately consulted, and that the fact that this public participation was defective meant that this environmental authorization should not have gone through. And what this meant for communities is that there wasn't any accessible notice. Documents were not translated and delivered in the rural communities there. The language barrier and the language challenge around how technical these documents will be and whether communities will be able to engage, and the amount of time that is given then to communities to engage and the forums that are presented for them to come and engage. And the last one is, if we are to look at the area in which the project is going to happen, is that there are farm workers and farm dwellers, and there wasn't any adequate consideration of their land rights, what it would mean for their land rights for this project to happen, and what consultation looks like for those farm workers and farm dwellers in that particular area if the project is to continue. Of a biggest concern is that in the granting of the environmental authorization, that they failed to adequately assess the climate, the air, and the groundwater impacts, and what it would mean from a community-based perspective. One, what is the local benefit of a fossil fuel project of such nature and of such extent for communities vis-a-vis the climate considerations, climate targets, that are meant to be met? Is there a need for such a project to go ahead? The second being the potential effects on breathing conditions for residents and farm workers, already given that for one of the provinces that is regarded as high priority, what does that mean for the air quality in the area? And the second is water access and water security, particularly for farming and for long-term land use. What would be the impact in that regard? There was a failure to consider the livelihoods and agricultural land use. One, crops and livestock, particularly given the exploration footprint. Tourism, which becomes a viable option for economic sustainability for communities. Farm operations for formal farmers and informal farmers, and what does the land tenure arrangements look like for such an expansive project? Then local employment. Would this introduce new employment? Would it create new jobs? What type of new jobs? And is the community adequately capacitated to be able to partake in employment in such an area? And obviously then the worker and resident health. What does it mean for public health effects around the exploration activities that would happen? Zara has gone to a great extent explaining the constitutional requirements in terms of Section 24 and the right to an environment that is not harmful to health or well-being. The National Environmental Management Act then has other obligations that it sets around the procedural obligations for environmental decision making, which we feel were inadequate in that there was no adequate consideration of those NEMA obligations. And then the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, which provides for judicial reviews and administrative decisions. We believe that in granting this EA, that certain elements were not considered, particularly the public participation and consultation. And this provides a ground for administrative review in terms of PAJA. We believe there are two parts for communities. The first is what we aim. Just to note that this environmental authorization was appealed. No decision has yet been given by the department, but we believe that there are two options that are available in regards to what can happen. Either the department or the minister will set aside the environmental authorization considered given and send it back. And this would allow for meaningful consultation of rural communities, that we will be able to provide higher evidentiary reports and expert reports around the impacts of gas exploration and fossil fuel production within the area, and that we would want to have it considered with the issue around the language barriers in public participation, considerations for livelihood, the impact of on water. But if this appeal is to fail, if our appeal is to be dismissed, we believe that there are stronger grounds and footing for this to proceed as a judicial review, and that some of the appeal grounds will be used for the purpose of that judicial review. What we currently have is there is some kind of leverage. The fact that we've been able to stall the project, there's a delay of implementation. There's the potential of a court review, but then there's also the potential to set the standard around community interests, public participation, climate considerations, and air and groundwater considerations for rural communities that can ensue from this particular case. I just want to note, though, that what becomes interesting for us in this regard is that, one, there is a need to have communities at the center of decision making, both by the department, but also by the IDC as a financial institution in what projects that they consider backing, that communities are constitutional right holders and they are not obstacles for development, that oil and gas activities can have long-term impacts on the environment, and that meaningful public participation is essential for local communities, especially the fact that they will bear the brunt of the environmental and social economic risks with very little economic benefits. We have seen the example of mining and the socioeconomic impacts of mining and the type of jobs that was created by coal mining. And gas is a higher level of technicality and expertise that is required. And in requiring that, most communities, particularly rural communities, will not be able to offer the type of jobs that will be required. What is symbolic about this report is that it goes beyond the thinking of one particular project, which is the Kinetiko Afro Energy project, but it examines that there is a broader need for development finance institutions such as the IDC to consider the Climate Change Act, the implications of fossil fuel projects with regards to the country's climate commitments, what legal requirements are put on development finance institutions, and where they consider to put their financing and their backing and their investments. And we have to ask the question whether regulatory authorization and financing decisions around new gas projects are evidence-based, whether finance institutions are considering some of the environmental impacts, whether they are considering whether such projects are consistent with the constitutional requirements and climate obligations. And of a concern for this particular project is Zara has indicated that they are saying they are piloting gas production, but they do not have a production right or license that allows them to do so. So technically speaking, and we have written to ask questions around this pilot production and what it means for communities is it's another way of extracting gas without actually having the license to do so, which is against the environmental regulations and licensing laws within the country. We obviously have to consider the environmental and climate impacts. So those considerations should not be from a licensing perspective only, but also from a financing perspective. What are the environmental and climate impacts? What is the responsibility of development finance institutions in ensuring that in considering fossil fuel production and its impact, what does it mean from a viability of project perspective? Just to note that from the legal perspective that CER, on behalf of the Free State Environmental Justice Network, will continue to assess the legal and regulatory framework governing upstream oil and gas development, and using this Kinetiko Afro Energy project to do so, that we have identified recurring legal vulnerabilities across exploration approvals, which will provide opportunities to strengthen environmental governance through potential strategic litigation where appropriate. And just on behalf, and unfortunately, the other speaker couldn't be here, but that communities need to be at the center of decision-making processes, but not only from a licensing perspective, but from a financing perspective in terms of how does it benefit communities from a socio-economic perspective, how does it impact communities from a climate justice perspective, and what does it mean for the environment and for the future of our consideration around the just energy transition in the country. I'll stop there. Thank you, Alia.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tarisai. It really illustrates how strong of a foundation the legal framing can be in helping us engage financial institutions as well, in advocating for not just stronger policies, but also better engagement and consultations with communities, and actually using that perspective to measure and understand development, much like this webinar is titled Development at What Cost. So the coalition really works to try to institutionalize these precedents you're setting as well. Next up, I will hand over to Rehana. Rehana Dada works in research, advocacy, journalism, and science communications with a main focus on environment and conservation, earth sciences, and development. She has recently focused on fossil and large-scale energy. She is a co-author on a report produced by Fair Finance Southern Africa and Justice Ambiental, which discusses the environmental impacts of offshore gas exploitation and exploration in Mozambique and flaws in the environmental impact assessments. Rehana, I will hand over to you while I start to share my screen with your slides.
Thanks, Alia, and thanks, Alia, Narato, and Fair Finance for the webinar. Congratulations to Zahra for this report. And then just also acknowledging Justiça Ambiental, the Stop Moss Gas campaign partners, the South Africa BDS Coalition, and the Stop ECOP Coalition. Also, Dr. Chris Engelbrecht, who's the lead author on the report True Risk, which looks at the environmental impacts. So any single project or financial institution, next slide, please, Any project, financial institution, or company has to be scrutinized individually and also as part of a web of projects, institutions, and companies with a vast footprint of social, environmental, and economic impacts. And then we also have to be looking at these impacts across borders and across time. So impacts on oceans and climate are global impacts that extend into the future. And states have obligations under international law to prevent harm outside their boundaries and to future generations caused by activities within their jurisdiction. So impacts on people and economies also have regional and global consequences. So among the drivers of migration are conflict, security conditions, worsened poverty, and climate change. And any support that South African institutions and companies are providing for fossil extraction or energy-intensive industries or projects in conflict zones or in countries with repressive governments is a contribution to regional and global impacts, which then also impact on the social welfare and security and development within its own borders. So this is very well illustrated with the current spate of very terrible vigilante violence across the country, which is spurred by legitimate anger against governance failures, but it is directed at the most vulnerable peoples who have fled conflict, poverty, and climate change disruptions. And we have to be keeping these links in mind. Next slide, please, Alia. So in Mozambique, the IDC is involved in two of the country's biggest projects, amongst others. So the Mozal smelter and the very notorious Mozambique LNG project in Cabo Delgado. Mozal is majority owned by Australian company South32, and the Mozambique state holds less than 4% of the smelter. It was closed in March. South32 cited failure to negotiate sufficient and cheap electricity, but there are other issues involved, including the European the new carbon the carbon it's a trade barrier that's coming in. I'm sorry, I've just forgotten. It's the CBAM. I've just forgotten the acronym. So in June, the IDC announced that it was going to weigh options to either buy South32's stakes or facilitate a change of ownership or sell its own stakes in the plant. And this plant has a troubling history around electricity. It needs 950 megawatt hours for normal operation. Eskom, South Africa's Eskom, is the main supplier. And Eskom buys more than 60% of the hydroelectric power from Cahora Bassa Dam, but then which it transmits directly to South Africa. It then transmits coal-generated electricity at a higher price back to Mozambique, to Mozal. And these are difficult arrangements that were established during apartheid and continued, in fact, worsened without proper adjustment. And so we have a situation there where South African state institution, IDC, partially owns Mozal, could become a majority owner. South African state-owned Eskom benefits. The smelter relies on Mozambican labor, and of course the environmental costs are carried by Mozambique. Next slide, please. The Mozambique LNG project in the far north of Mozambique in Cabo Delgado province is supported by the IDC by a loan of $150 million. So this is a project that is operated by a French company and majority owned by a French company, Total Energies. It's co-owned by Japanese, Indian, and Thai companies, and there's only one African owner, the Mozambique state company, Empresa Nacional de Hidrocarbonetos. And this Mozambique LNG project carries enormous security, economic, social, and environmental risks. Mozambique's benefits from the project are actually very low, and it holds high and growing risks, including economic risks. The regional conflict has in Cabo Delgado has resulted in severe violence against civilians since 2017. Displaced over 1.3 million people, many multiple times. Over 6,000 deaths are recorded, multiple incidents of violence and brutality and sexual violence against civilians. perpetrated by insurgents, but with accusations also, many accusations against the public troops who are meant to be there for security in the region. This conflict is driven by worsened poverty, distrust in government, and disenfranchisement, and it developed alongside the extractive industry in the province, with the gas project being the largest. And this is occurring in Mozambique, which is a country with increasingly severe repression of media and civic freedoms, where journalists have faced intimidation and disappearance for reporting on the Cabo Delgado conflict or exposing corruption. One recent case that has to be mentioned is that of investigative environmental journalist Estacio Valoy, who has reported on Cabo Delgado, but was faced investigation by the Mozambique crime intelligence for a report he did on illegal logging. And this is important context for a project that IDC and other African public finance institutions support. Next slide, please. Mozambique has Mozambique LNG, in collaboration with the Rovuma LNG. They share the same onshore infrastructure and much of the same marine infrastructure, has resulted in displacement of over 10,000 people. It has resulted in reduced access to the sea. This is an area where people depend on nature-based livelihoods. It is currently operating in a security enclave that excludes local people from job and business opportunities, and it has dumped Mozambique with huge costs relating to security conditions. Next slide, please. The environmental impacts are significant, and there are very many. My slides might have gone a little bit out of order. But to touch on the climate impacts from this project, conservatively, we're looking at full end-use emissions of about 3 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. This would carry, at the moment, the social cost of carbon is sitting on about $1,200 per ton. So this could potentially, at the upper end, run to a cost of 12 trillion by the end of the century. This being the social cost of carbon from the projects in the current Rovuma Basin. The estimates there are around 5 trillion cubic meters of gas in the basin. Next slide, please. So still on the environmental impacts, there are severe flaws. A study done last year by Justiça Ambiental and Fair Finance indicated that there is just not enough known about the ecological value of the region, or a full understanding of the full impacts of deep sea gas activities to be able to accurately predict impacts or prevent irreversible ecological damage. And there were many flaws and omissions. The one key one is there was no adequate marine ecology survey conducted in the deep water environment. And in fact, the review of the deep sea reefs was limited to footage that was obtained as part of the exploration work. Next slide, please. And then the full impacts of including chemical, physical, and acoustic pollution, alien invasive species coming in from vastly increased shipping, and of course climate change. The full impacts of these on the ecosystems and biodiversity over different periods of time is not known. The cumulative impacts of the multiple projects in the Rovuma Basin is not known. Next slide, please. I think next slide, please, Alia. I've changed the order a little bit. Okay, good. So this project is associated with allegations of severe human rights violations. Total Energies, in fact, faces 2 criminal complaints in France for allegations of human rights violations, but relating to its conduct during a major attack in 2021, and relating to allegations of severe human rights violations, including a massacre in the months shortly after that attack, also in 2021. And then this year, journalistic investigations by Forbidden Stories revealed new allegations of human rights violations involving the gas project employees. Next slide, please. And as a result of the human rights risks, in December last year, two major financial institutions, UKEF and Atradius Dutch State Business, both withdrew. Yet every other financial institution involved in this project has remained. This includes Industrial Development Corporation, African Development Bank of Southern Africa, Afreximbank, and Export Credit Insurance Corporation. South Africa also has private institutions providing significant financing. So that's Standard Bank, Nedbank, Absa, and FirstRand Rand Merchant. Although it has to be noted, FirstRand and Rand Merchant declined to fund the second floating project of any in the Rovuma Basin. So there's significant continuing investment from South Africa and Africa into a project that harms Mozambique. Next slide, please. So it's then also important to look at the patterns and networks of impacts of each of the companies involved. So Total Energies has extensive operations across Africa, and these carry similar threads of displaced peoples, harmed ecology, and significant contribution to climate change to enable the extraction of energy intended primarily for northern markets from the lands of communities with low energy security, high reliance on sustainable nature-based livelihoods, and high vulnerability to climate change. Next slide, please. Mozambique's Bandancoa Dam, of course, is one that Total Energies is involved with, would result in the displacement of 4,100 female people and cause untold ecological harm. In Uganda and Tanzania, Total Energies is the main driver of the ICOP project. It's a 1,400 kilometer heated pipeline running through several ecologically sensitive areas and displacing over 100,000 people. Community members, activists, and journalists report intimidation and worse. Next slide, please. In the Cuvette Central, in the Congo Basin, Total Energies holds oil concessions, and 52 new blocks were opened this year, and it's likely that extraction in that region would be linked to ICOP. And then coming back to South Africa, Total Energies holds exploration blocks offshore, which obviously impacts on the climate obligations of both South Africa and France. Next slide, please. This is the one-year anniversary of the International Court of Justice Advisory on State Climate Change Obligations. Zahra spoke to this a little bit earlier. But this, I mean, there were a couple of fundamental or groundbreaking decisions in that, one of which is that climate change is a matter of human rights. And this advisory places accountability on states for the climate impacts of companies and institutions under their jurisdiction. This was also adopted by the UN General Assembly in May this year. And this case will impact on future generations who will ultimately be saddled with both climate impacts and future reparations bills. Next slide, please. The second case that is quite important, ICG case or other ICG cases that are also important, relate to Israel. This is also the second year anniversary of the ICJ advisory on Israel's policies and practices in Palestinian waters. South Africa has an ongoing case at the ICJ on preventing genocide. And so it's also important to look at South Africa's own support here for apartheid and genocide. Through Glencore, South Africa is the main supplier of coal to Israel, which Israel depends on for its electricity. There has been strong local and international opposition, but this export persists, which makes South Africa a material contributor to a genocidal war economy. Coming back to the IDC is involved with Glencore on a separate mining project in Prisca. Nonetheless, a state institution is directly involved with a company in South Africa that is directly and doing business on on South African minerals. This is a copper mine, the Priska zinc copper project mine. I'm so sorry. A Priska copper zinc mine. And so we have this situation where IDC is directly involved with Glencore, which is directly supporting a genocidal state. Next slide, please. Two other projects that are important in relation to the ICGA cases on Israel and climate change. Firstly, an Israeli company, Navitas, could enter into South African waters. It has bought controlling shares in a strategic offshore block in the Orange Basin on the border of Namibia and South Africa. This still needs approval from the South African government, and this is a test of the country's commitments to its human rights and climate obligations. And this is a deal that South African civil society and government must reject. And secondly, also relating to greenwashing through carbon trading and offsets, Amazon has announced a scheme in the Eastern Cape that will result in the creation of a single species plantation. This is a false solution to climate change. It creates new ecological stresses, and it enables Amazon to continue high emissions, which I'm sure we know about with AI data centers. Amazon is also accused of complicity in Israel's apartheid and genocide against Palestinians. Next slide, please. So we do need to be talking about financial institutions or projects or companies or states in the context of these vast webs of impacts and human rights violations and national and international obligations. With the IDC, with the Kinetiko project, the IDC must be held accountable for supporting the project in the first place. And it must also be held accountable for its support for any projects and companies linked to human rights and environmental violations, worsened security conditions, economic harm, and any benefits from deals with oppressive governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Rehana. I think this presentation in particular really showcases one of our main captions as a coalition, or one of our main messages, which is finance is not neutral. So often folks ask us, what is the aim of the work? What is the demand of the work? But really being able to assess the case studies and the real world impacts highlight that it's not just always a case of we need financing, it needs to be spent, but understanding what is there and how it's spent really helps us make very specific demands and requests. So we have about 10 minutes actually for a few shorter minutes. Would the panel mind if I shorten the questions? I have 3 questions, maybe different panelists can answer. I do want to leave time for a Q&A, so I don't want to go into too much detail. But for any of our speakers to answer, so Zara, Tarisai, or Rehana, some questions we wanted to pose include, if the IEA says no fossil fuels, why are South African public institutions still funding gas? And what should the IDC be funding instead? So I open that up to any speaker. I think Zara, that may be up your alley, and then I will share the other 2 questions. But if you are able to keep it brief, then we'll have some time for questions. Thanks, Zara.
Thanks, Alia. Just tell me if my connection goes off because it is a bit wonky.
Sounds okay.
So why are the PFI still funding gas? So I'd say for various reasons. The first is their political mandate. So as state organs and essentially the financial arm of the state, they do have a mandate to finance South Africa's development policy and its energy mix in terms of the National Development Plan and the Electricity Plan. And this policy mandate often gets prioritized over its legislative mandate and over its domestic and international legal obligations. And so we recommend IDC does relook at its policies and interrogate its own policy mandate and South Africa's development policy. And then secondly is the narrative of the gas cliff. Gas is often positioned as a solution to the looming gas cliff in, I think, 2030, when supplies from Mozambique run out. And so it's kind of ironic that a crisis like the gas cliff, which was caused by a gas dependency, is now also being solved by more gas dependency in South Africa. And then also what we spoke about as the bridge fuel myth. So gas as a way to reduce emissions, as a cleaner alternative to coal, while we facilitate the transition to renewables. And this myth has also been busted. Gas does produce less carbon dioxide when burnt, rather than coal, but the methane emissions across the life cycle of LNG cancels out any benefits that LNG can have for power generation. And then also a recent study by the climate and transition think tank Southern Transitions last year in October did find that renewable energy is now the lowest cost option for power generation in most regions around the world.
Thank you, Zara. I think you did go through some recommendations as well in your slide. My next question is for Tarisai. I think you talked about the precedents being set in this report, but the cases as well, not just for this project, but for future policies and processes. Could you give perhaps any examples for maybe how can other communities use these precedents if they see, a project perhaps coming up in their area, and where would this information or could this information be available? Thanks.
Thanks, Alia. I think the first is that Parliament and legislation has set the benchmarks for public participation. So for communities to constantly keep a lookout for notices that indicate that there are either gas projects that are being proposed in their area. For communities to just also understand that they have rights in terms of public participation in questioning those proposed projects within the area. And the other is that through the Thabametsi judgment, climate impacts and climate considerations should be sort of the benchmark for consideration in applications, particularly for fossil fuel production, that is coal, oil, and gas. The critique that we have is that the climate assessments that are being done by the environmental companies that are appointed by these companies to do assessments on their behalf are just not adequate in considering the real climate impacts and what they mean for communities. So I think our biggest call is to ensure that communities are aware that there are organizations that work within the space, even outside of the Center for Environmental Rights, that can assist them in understanding, in reading documents that are provided for them to be able to adequately participate in application processes within their area, but also for them to understand that they have the right to ask for information, to write and ask for clarity in regards to the information provided to them, and that information should be provided in a language that they understand, given just the science and the technical aspects that are always presented in the applications for these production rights. and also just an understanding that with the various forums that are there, that outside of opposing applications that are happening within their area, that there are legal reforms that are happening to sort of speed up the process for oil and gas production. With the Upstream Petroleum and Development Act, there's an introduction of a gas bill that is currently out. And comments are due, I think, the 7th of August. Those are opportunities for communities to engage at that level, to understand what proposed legislation means for them and their communities, how then it will in turn be interpreted to allow development within their area, and what would that development mean for them from an environmental and climate perspective, and for them to adequately participate in those processes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tarisai. We will be sharing the recording of this as well if you'd like to hear that response again. We have one question in the chat that I'd like to direct to Rehana, if that's okay. Just reading that out loud. A question from Patrick Bond. The Pretoria government is in denial about climate debt, even though a tiny number of companies and wealthy managers are responsible for the world's highest relative historical CO2 emissions. Pretoria backs these emitters against the ICJ ruling on the need to acknowledge liabilities alongside 35 reactionary climate denialist regimes and even EU members. Do we have a way to address the logic of climate debt in these reports and lawsuits in a manner that can raise cost to Pretoria of this sort of climate debt denialism? Thank you.
Thanks, Alia, and thanks for the question. I think my mind immediately goes to we are seeing a lot more climate litigation. The ICJ case, there was an Inter-American ruling last year as well. The Law of the Sea ruling in 2024, and I'm forgetting something. Obviously, the ICJ Climate Advisory. These are all providing, I think, backing for stronger legislative challenges of these. We've sat in the negotiations for 30 years with governments denying responsibility and basically negotiating themselves out of being able to take responsibility or be held accountable, and maybe legislation is the way. Litigation, not legislation. Forgive me, my words get mixed up. So climate litigation is what I'm suggesting might be the way to tackle these things. But I think I think there are a couple of things that we have to be remembering all the time. Climate change is a human rights issue. It is about future generations, and it's not only about impact. It is also about the right of future generations to benefit from fossil fuels. So we need to be thinking a lot more strategically about how we access or how we exploit the reserves going forward. We do need to be accountable as states, but also as high emitters. In every country or in every society, there are high and low emitters, and we need to be recognizing that consumerism, from the middle class up, is something that we do need to be holding ourselves responsible for. And yeah.
Thank you, Rehana. We have reached the last 2 minutes of the webinar today and our time together. I just want to say thank you very much to all of our speakers for their compelling insights. And thank you to those who have used the chat box and your question, Patrick. As we bring today's webinar to a close, we do return to the core question: development at what cost? So the evidence in the report has made one thing clear: continued public investment in gas is not a harmless strategy, but one that exposes public funds to stranded assets, future reparation risks, and climate debt, but also undermines community health, water security, and contradicts global science and national obligations. Public institutions should not be misusing public capital to lock us into decades of harmful fossil fuel resilience at the expense of green and sustainable development. So as we close today, we do call on the IDC to respond to our report with immediate policy alignment with climate targets and plans to ensure phase out of fossil fuels. But we also call on the IDC to enhance transparency and accountability while centering communities and a truly just transition. To our partners in civil society and legal organizations, media, as well as the public joining today, help us share this report and also challenge the understanding of gas being a bridge fuel, and use this evidence to hold our public finance institutions accountable to the people that they are meant to be serving. I have put the link to the report in the chat box, so feel free to download that report, engage us as the coalition or any of the organizations speaking today. We do also have popular education workshops and webinars, as well as reports going out. It's not easy to engage a public finance institution, but we are trying, and hopefully this strengthens the self-determination of communities that we work with as well. Thank you once again to everybody for joining, and thank you again to the speakers and the writers of this report and those involved in the appeals. And we will share the recordings as soon as they are available. So thank you, everybody. I'll stop the recording now and end the webinar. Thanks again.